If you've ever closed your eyes at night and imagined stepping back in time, the age of the Crusades might seem like one of those epic, cinematic eras. Grand armies on horseback, glittering armor in the sun, and distant calls for holy quests echoing across the hills. But don't let the romantic images fool you. Because if you were dropped into the real world of the Crusades, even for just one day, the truth is, you probably wouldn't survive. The people who lived through this era weren't just tough. They were hardened by famine, disease, political chaos, and an overwhelming sense that the world was constantly on the edge of falling apart. It wasn't just knights and castles. It was a time of fear, uncertainty, and brutal survival. So if you've found a quiet moment to unwind, and you're here hoping for a peaceful journey into the past, you're in the right place. Welcome to another episode of Boring History for Sleep, where we trade shocking plot twists for slow, steady storytelling and a soothing dive into the gritty details of real history. If you enjoy what you hear, only if it helps you relax, consider liking and subscribing. And while you're listening, feel free to share where and when you're tuning in, whether you're bundled in blankets during a rainy evening or letting this story drift you off under the stars. Tonight, we'll step softly into the shadows of medieval Europe and the Holy Land, during one of the most turbulent periods in human history. But unlike the flashy battles and heroic tales you've heard before, we'll focus on what life was really like, on the ground, among the peasants, merchants, soldiers, and wanderers who had no choice but to endure the harsh rhythms of the age. From the stench of overcrowded cities to the uncertainty of surviving the road to Jerusalem, every chapter will draw you deeper into a world that was unforgiving, unfamiliar, and far from glorious. So dim your lights, take a deep breath, and let go of the modern world. You're about to explore a day in the age of the Crusades, one you likely wouldn't survive, but one we'll walk through together, slowly and gently, until your eyes grow heavy and sleep begins to take hold. The first thing you would notice, before you even opened your eyes, is the cold. It isn't the sharp, bitter cold of winter wind or snow, but a deep, creeping chill that's sunk into the very stones of the small room where you're sleeping. There's no insulation. No glass windows. Just wooden shutters that never fully seal, letting the night air drift in without resistance. The bedding beneath you is a pile of straw that scratches your skin and rustles with every movement. It smells faintly of old hay and something mustier, like damp wool and smoke. You draw your rough blanket closer, but it's thin, woven from coarse, undyed wool, and full of tiny holes worn through over many winters. You've slept in your clothes again, like most people do, not for comfort, but because taking them off at night would mean exposing yourself to the raw elements of the house. And in the age of the Crusades, comfort is not a luxury most people are granted. The house is dark, lit only by the faint light of early dawn leaking through the cracks in the shutters. You're lucky to even have a home. Many others sleep in huts made of sod and branches or in corners of crowded inns with strangers pressed shoulder to shoulder. This home is made of stone, though crudely shaped, with smoke-blackened beams crossing the low ceiling. There's no chimney. The fire from last night still smolders in the hearth, but its warmth faded hours ago. The smell of old smoke lingers thick in the air, mixed with the pungent odor of your family's chamber pot tucked in the corner, waiting to be emptied. Your muscles ache. Not from anything specific, but from the simple toll of daily life. Beds aren't soft. Food isn't plentiful. Life during the Crusades wears you down, slowly and constantly. Outside, you hear the low bray of a donkey and the distant clatter of hooves on cobbled stone. Somewhere down the street, a market stall is being set up. But you don't have time to listen. There's too much to do. You sit up slowly, careful not to wake the others. You share this room with at least 5 family members. Privacy is a foreign concept. Your brother sleeps against the far wall, curled into himself like a cat. Your mother lies on her side, her thin frame covered by a patched-up blanket. Beside her, a younger sister stirs in her sleep, sniffling from the cold. The walls are close, and everything echoes in this tight space. A sneeze, a cough, even a whispered word can feel loud. You rise and begin your morning routine, not that it resembles anything modern ears might expect. There's no running water. No soap. You grab a cloth and walk outside to a nearby well, passing other villagers bundled in cloaks and worn tunics. The village is a small one, clustered along a dirt path that has turned to thick mud in the spring rains. Chickens wander freely, scratching at the ground. A dog limps past, its ribs visible, eyes wary. No one smiles. Not at this hour. At the well, the line is already forming. Water is precious. You take your turn, lowering the wooden bucket on its rope and waiting for the soft splash far below. Your fingers are already numb by the time you bring the water back up. You splash a little on your face, and the shock of cold steals your breath. That's your bath for the day. Maybe even for the week. Back at home, breakfast is being prepared, if you can call it that. A hard crust of yesterday's bread, soaked in thin broth, made from boiled onions and cabbage. There's no meat, not this early in the week. That's a Sunday luxury, and only if your household is doing well. You eat slowly, chewing through the tough bread, careful not to crack a tooth. There's no dentist here. A broken tooth means a lifetime of pain. And there's no sugar in your diet, at least not yet, so while cavities are rare, infections are common. Most people's teeth are worn down by the age of 30. As you eat, talk turns to the same subject it always does, the war. Not just any war, but the war. The Crusade. Your father speaks of it with bitterness. He's too old to fight now, but he remembers when he was a boy and men marched off with pride in their eyes and crosses stitched into their tunics. They didn't all come back. The ones who did return changed. Some were sick. Others were missing limbs. Most were quiet. Haunted. You've heard rumors that a new call to arms is coming. Another wave. Another holy quest. The priests say it's God's will that the land of Jerusalem must be reclaimed. That the infidels must be driven out. But here, far from the Holy Land, it all sounds distant and terrifying. The people around you barely have enough to survive. The thought of leaving home, crossing seas, and facing unknown enemies feels like madness. And yet, every day more men leave, drawn by promises of salvation, honor, or simply the hope of escaping poverty. You finish your meal and begin your chores. The Crusades haven't touched your village directly, but their shadow falls over everything. Taxes have increased. Food is scarcer. Bandits roam the forests, taking advantage of the chaos. Every able-bodied man who leaves makes the village weaker. Trade routes are more dangerous now, and many merchants refuse to travel without armed escorts. That makes goods harder to find and more expensive when they arrive. Salt, spices, iron, everything costs more. And when people can't pay, they turn desperate. Your first chore is tending the animals. You walk to the small wooden shed where the goat is kept. It bleats when it sees you, stamping its hooves impatiently. You feed it what little you can spare. The milk it gives is thin and barely enough for your family. You check the chickens next. 3 eggs today. A good haul. You place them carefully in a basket. They'll be traded at the market for oil and cloth. Maybe a little barley, if you're lucky. Later, you help your mother wash clothes at the stream. The water is icy, your fingers quickly going red. You scrub each piece against a stone, then rinse and wring it out. Your knuckles bleed from the cold. She says nothing. This is just how it is. The day moves slowly. You spend the afternoon gathering firewood, keeping an eye out for wolves or thieves. It's not paranoia. It's survival. A lone traveler, even a boy or woman, can disappear in these woods without a trace. You stick to familiar paths, fingers gripping the small knife at your side, a poor defense, but better than nothing. The birds are quiet. The wind whispers through the trees. You don't linger. By evening, your hands are raw, your legs sore, your stomach empty again. Dinner is more of the same, stew made from leftover broth and a few turnips. The fire warms the room, but the smoke stings your eyes. You eat in silence, watching the shadows flicker on the stone walls. Outside, the sky turns black. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rings. You whisper a short prayer, asking for safety, for peace, for enough food tomorrow. Then you crawl back onto the straw bedding and pull the blanket over your shoulders. You don't dream of glory, You dream of warmth, of full bellies, of quiet days without fear. But even that feels distant. As the first light of day edges over the horizon, you rise before the sun fully crests the treetops. The chill of the previous morning has not lifted. It lingers like a stubborn fog clinging to the village, settling in the cracks of the wooden doors and weaving between the loose stones of the road. Today is market day, and though you're still sore from yesterday's chores, the village marketplace is one of the few places where people must show up, no matter how they feel. The market is the heart of the town. Not because it's glamorous or thriving, but because it's necessary. This is where life is bartered, traded, and haggled for one egg, one threadbare tunic, one handful of salt at a time. You gather the few things your family has to offer. The 3 eggs from yesterday are tucked carefully in a straw-lined basket. A small pouch holds dried herbs your mother has bundled. There's also a tightly wrapped bundle of coarse wool thread, dyed brown with bark and soot, that you hope might catch the attention of a cloth merchant. It's not much, but every trade counts. With luck, you might return with enough grain for 2 more days of porridge. Or maybe, if the baker is in good spirits, a chunk of hard cheese. The road to the market isn't far, but it feels long. Mud cakes your shoes within minutes. The village has no cobblestones, only hardened paths carved out by repetition. Wagons have left deep ruts in the earth, and puddles sit like traps, waiting for the careless. You pass other villagers carrying similar bundles, some pushing carts, others dragging sacks behind them. A few wear better cloaks, the kind with lining and leather ties. Most look like you, cloaked in hand-stitched tunics that have seen too many winters. As you enter the marketplace, the noise greets you first. It isn't loud in a joyous or bustling way, but in the grating, gritty chorus of tired voices. There are shouts, yes, but they're sharp and clipped, arguments over prices, threats to cheaters, prayers to ward off thieves. Livestock bleats and clucks, feet stomp through thick muck, and tin bells clink on makeshift shop awnings made of stretched canvas or worn hides. The smell is immediate and overwhelming. Animal droppings, stale bread, overripe vegetables, wood smoke, sweat, and something unmistakably foul that might be rotting meat or perhaps just unwashed humanity. The stalls are made of rough planks nailed together, some leaning precariously. Merchants drape their goods in coarse cloth to keep the flies off. Each seller has carved out a patch of ground, claimed either by force or by family legacy. There are no official permits here. If you have goods and the strength to defend your corner, you can sell. If not, you risk being pushed aside, sometimes physically. You make your way to a familiar face, an older woman who often takes eggs in exchange for barley. She looks you over with the narrowed eyes of someone who's been tricked before. "These fresh?" she asks, voice rasped by age and suspicion. You nod, trying to sound confident. "Late just yesterday." She takes one and holds it to her ear, giving it a gentle shake. It's a silly ritual. Eggs don't talk, but people in this time are wary. Everything could be spoiled, infested, or cursed. She finally nods and points to a half-empty sack behind her. You reach in and scoop out a small amount of barley. It's less than what she offered last time. "That's not much," you say, hesitant. She shrugs. "Times are hard. The soldiers took more than expected this week." You don't argue. You can't. Everyone knows the local lord has raised the grain tax again to support the next crusade. Caravans leaving for the Holy Land need food, horses, and supplies. The nobility doesn't pay for it themselves. They extract it from the people, even those who have no intention of ever seeing Jerusalem. As you move on to the next stall, a group of men push past you. They wear bits of chain mail under worn cloaks, their belts heavy with daggers and short swords. Crusader recruits. Some are newly enlisted, eager to play the part of holy warriors. Others are veterans, marked by missing fingers, bent backs, and eyes that dart at shadows. They laugh loudly and nudge each other, calling out to vendors with the kind of authority only the armed can wield. A butcher offers them dried meat without asking for coin. It's safer that way. You watch quietly from the side. It's hard to tell whether they're heroes or predators. In truth, they might be both. The line between holy war and lawless violence is razor thin in this time. Especially here, far from the battlefield but still ruled by its hunger. Further down the row, you pass a stall selling iron tools, axes, nails, horseshoes. The blacksmith is a massive man with arms like tree trunks, his skin permanently darkened by soot. He barely looks up as you approach. You have nothing he wants. Iron is precious, and your herbs and thread won't cover the cost of even a single nail. Still, you linger. Tools mean survival. With an axe, your family could cut wood more efficiently, clear fields, defend themselves. But even wishing feels dangerous here. So you move on. You stop at a fabric stall, hoping to trade your bundle of thread. The woman there examines it briefly, then offers you a small piece of rough linen in exchange, barely enough to patch a knee. You consider saying no, but in this world, even scraps have value. You nod and make the trade. As you walk away, someone bumps into you hard from behind. You turn quickly, instinctively clutching your pouch. It's still there. Just a drunken farmer stumbling by. Or so you hope. Thieves are common in the marketplace, especially children. They're quick, small, and desperate. You've seen boys no older than 7 sprint between stalls, snatching bread or apples and vanishing into the crowd. Punishments are harsh. Some get caught and lose fingers. Others disappear entirely. But the fear of hunger is stronger than the fear of justice. As the sun climbs higher, the crowd thickens. A priest appears, chanting in Latin, holding a small cross aloft. His robes are stained and patched, his eyes tired. He speaks of salvation, of sacrifice, of the glory waiting for those who answer the Pope's call. A few villagers stop to listen, murmuring prayers or crossing themselves. Others walk past, unmoved. The promises of the church ring hollow when your belly is empty. Nearby, a young woman cries out. A man has grabbed her basket and is demanding her bread. She resists, and he shouts that she owes him from last week. A small crowd gathers. No one intervenes. Eventually, the woman gives up the bread and walks away with tears in her eyes. The man eats it in front of her without shame. There is no law here except power. And during the age of the Crusades, power is shifting constantly, between lords, between priests, between those with weapons and those without. You finish your trades and prepare to leave. The weight of the barley in your pouch is pitiful, but it's something. You look back once more at the market, at the chaos, the desperation, the tired eyes and wary glances. It's a place where people cling to life by their fingernails. Where survival is a transaction. Where every deal is a gamble. As you walk back home, the mud grips your shoes tighter than before. The wind picks up, carrying with it the scent of ash and something metallic. Perhaps blood from the butcher's stall or iron from the blacksmith's forge. You don't know. You don't want to. You're exhausted. Your hands are stained. Your back aches from carrying the basket. And you've done nothing out of the ordinary. This is just a regular market day in the age of the Crusades. And tomorrow will be no easier. By the third morning in the age of the Crusades, your body has started to adapt to the rhythm of survival, though not with comfort. Hunger is a constant companion, not the sharp pain of starvation but the dull ache of never quite being full. Your joints creak more than they should for your age, and the chill that lives in the stone walls of your home follows you even into the sunlight. But today is Sunday, a day of rest, or so the church claims. In truth, it's one of the busiest and most rigidly structured days of the week, dominated not by work in the fields, but by obligations to a power even greater than your Lord, the Church. The bells ring early, long before the village truly wakes. Their deep, mournful tones roll across the thatched rooftops and crooked lanes, signaling that Mass is near. You and your family dress in your cleanest garments, which, despite being washed yesterday in the stream, are still stained, frayed, and unevenly mended. Your tunic is too short at the sleeves, your sister's cloak is patched at the shoulders, and your mother wraps her head in a cloth that's been whitened by age rather than dye. Still, you all try to look your best. Not because anyone will be impressed, but because the church sees everything, and judges just as much. The church building itself is one of the oldest structures in the village, built of grey stone and crowned with a modest wooden steeple. There is no glass in the windows, only old parchment that filters the light into a dim, flickering haze. Inside, the pews are rough-hewn benches. The walls are cold and damp, their stones darkened by centuries of incense smoke and candle soot. Wooden crucifixes hang from the walls, their figures stern and silent, and a faded tapestry depicting the Last Supper hangs behind the altar. It sways slightly in the draught that slips under the doorway. The priest is already at the front when you arrive, his robes heavy and embroidered with golden thread that glitters in the low light. Compared to the villagers, he is wealthy, not by noble standards, but by yours. He has clean boots, a warm cloak lined with fur, and the rare luxury of a full stomach. He speaks in Latin for most of the service, words few in the congregation understand, but all pretend to. That's part of the ritual. You kneel when he signals, bow your head when expected, and cross yourself at every familiar phrase. These gestures are as ingrained as breathing. You glance around during the sermon. Every face is tired, most are downcast. Children fidget on their mothers' laps, men stare straight ahead, and old women mouth prayers with trembling lips. It is not reverence that fills the room, it is fear, habit, and hope clinging by a thread. The church isn't just a place of worship. It is the moral and legal backbone of society, the enforcer of behavior, the arbiter of sin and salvation. If the priest says a man is blessed, he is. If he says you are cursed, you may never shake that judgment. He can take your last coin, your last loaf, and claim it's God's will. No one will challenge him. Today, the sermon focuses on the Crusades. Again. The priest speaks with passion, his voice rising like the wind through the bell tower. He speaks of Jerusalem, the city of God, defiled by non-believers. He speaks of brave knights and holy missions, of sins washed away by swords raised in righteous fury. He points at the young men in the room and urges them to consider the path of the pilgrim warrior. He reminds them that those who die in service of the cross are granted immediate entrance to heaven. No confession required. No penance owed. This message has been delivered 100 times before. And yet, each time it stirs something in the hearts of the villagers. Not because they long for battle, but because the promise of forgiveness is more tempting than gold. In this world, sin is everywhere, stealing, lying, envy, desire. The church teaches that even thoughts can doom you. But one act, one decision to pick up the cross and march east, could wash all that away. It's the ultimate bargain. You watch as a boy, barely older than you, raises his hand. The priest smiles. Another recruit. Another soul redeemed, or damned, depending on how you see it. His mother weeps softly in the back pew. She knows what it means. Few who leave ever return, and those who do are not the same. After the service, the priest stands outside the church, accepting offerings. Some bring coins. Others bring bread or eggs. A few bring nothing but a bow of the head, hoping it's enough. You offer a handful of barley, and he nods without thanks. That nod is all the recognition you'll get. You walk home in silence, your feet aching from kneeling, your mind heavy with questions. Is God really watching? Does he care who fights and who suffers? Does he listen to the prayers of peasants, or only the chants of those who can afford candles for the altar? Back at home, the rest of the day is dedicated to quiet chores. No plowing nor hunting, it would be sinful, but mending clothes, sweeping the hearth, or tending the sick are permitted. You help your sister pull burrs from a wool blanket, your fingers moving slowly through the coarse fabric. Outside, smoke drifts from chimneys. A few neighbors gather to talk. They speak in low voices about the sermon, about the boy who volunteered, about rumors of a papal emissary coming through the region. Some believe it means another tithe will be demanded. Others whisper that new laws are coming, ones that will force every able-bodied man into the crusade. You remember stories you've heard from returning pilgrims. Stories of seasickness and starvation, of sandstorms and arrows that strike without warning, of cities burned and looted, of innocents slaughtered alongside soldiers. But also of riches beyond imagination, gold, spices, silks. tales that dazzle and frighten all at once. Stories that seem unreal, but linger nonetheless. The Crusades are not just a war. They are a dream and a nightmare, a path to glory and a road to ruin. In the evening, your father pulls out a small book, a rare object, handwritten and precious. He cannot read it, nor can you, but the priest once read from it aloud. Its pages are worn and thin, the ink faded. He holds it reverently, like a relic. It reminds him, and all of you, that there is more to the world than mud and hunger. That perhaps, beyond the suffering, there is meaning. Or at least the hope of it. As the sun sets, you light a tallow candle and sit quietly by the hearth. The flames dance against the stone, casting long shadows across the room. Your mother hums a hymn under her breath, a tune older than memory. You feel a weight in your chest, not sadness, exactly, but something heavier. A sense that life is being lived under a ceiling of expectations you cannot rise above. That your worth is measured not in kindness or labor, but in your ability to obey, to endure, to submit. This is the age of the Crusades. The Church is not just your spiritual guide, it is your ruler, your judge, your map to salvation. And whether you believe in everything it teaches or simply fear what might happen if you don't, its grip is unshakable. In a world where questions go unanswered and suffering is explained away as divine testing, there is little room for doubt. And yet, as you lay down once more on your straw bedding, you feel it creeping in, slowly, silently, like the chill air curling beneath the door. The sun rises again, but light brings no comfort in the age of the Crusades. Morning begins with the same pattern as always: a scratchy blanket, stiff limbs, the scent of cold ash and unwashed wool. But today something feels off before you even open your eyes. The silence in the room is too still. It isn't the calm of peace, it's the hush that creeps in when something is wrong. You sit up slowly, blinking in the dim light. Your younger sister, who usually chatters in the morning even in her sleep, lies motionless beneath the blanket. Her face is pale. Her brow glistens with sweat. Her eyes, when they flutter open, are red-rimmed and distant. Your mother is already at her side, pressing a damp cloth to her forehead. She doesn't speak. Her jaw is tight, and her eyes flick up at you just long enough to confirm what you already know: she's afraid. Not just of a simple illness, but of the kind of sickness that spreads through a household like a shadow swallowing the sun. In the age of the Crusades, illness is a part of life. But more than that, it's a threat that looms over every family. There are no hospitals, no vaccines, no modern understanding of germs or hygiene. The village has no doctor. What you have is a healer, an old woman who lives near the edge of the woods, half respected, half feared. She knows herbs, whispers incantations under her breath, and seems to always appear when someone is dying or has just died. Some call her a wise woman. Others call her something darker. You are sent to fetch her. The path to her cottage winds through a part of the village most people avoid. Trees grow thicker here, and the ground is soft underfoot. Crows caw overhead, hopping from bare branch to bare branch. Her home is a strange thing, half hut, half shrine, with bones tied above the door and bundles of dried plants hanging from the eaves. The door creaks as you knock, and it swings open without anyone touching it. Inside, the air is thick with the smell of rosemary, garlic, and something sharp and bitter that makes your eyes water. She's already there, standing by the fire. Wrinkled, hunched, and cloaked in layers of tattered robes, she turns and stares at you as though she expected you before you arrived. You don't speak. You just nod, and she gathers her things: bundles of dried root, jars of salves, a pouch of something black and crumbling. The walk back feels longer. You don't make small talk. She mutters as she walks, sometimes to herself, sometimes to things that aren't there. When you return home, your sister is shivering beneath the blanket. Her skin is flushed now, hot to the touch. Her breath comes in short, sharp gasps. Your mother steps aside, and the healer begins her work. She crushes herbs in a stone bowl, mixes them with wine, and forces them between your sister's lips. She lays wet leaves across her chest and ties them down with strips of cloth. She lights a bundle of dried sage and waves it over the bed, chanting words you don't recognize. The smoke curls in the air like fingers searching for something to grasp. The healer rubs oil on your sister's feet, whispers into her ears, and places a small wooden charm beneath her pillow. When she's done, she stands and says nothing. Just nods once, collects her things, and leaves. She doesn't say whether your sister will live or die. That is the nature of healing in the age of the Crusades. There is no certainty. No prescriptions. Just hope, rituals, and the quiet understanding that sometimes nothing works. Disease is as common as rain. Coughs turn to fevers, wounds to infections. A scraped knee can end a life. A sore throat can mean your entire family will fall ill before the week is over. You spend the day tending to your sister. She sleeps restlessly, murmuring nonsense through cracked lips. You change her cloths when they grow hot, hold her hand when she jerks awake in confusion, spoon broth into her mouth when she can swallow. Outside, the village continues as always. The world does not stop for sickness. Neighbors do not visit. Illness is feared, and rightly so. The last time sickness swept through the village, it took 12 souls in 2 weeks. The church bells rang so often that people began to dread their sound. Masses were held in the open air, and the priests sprinkled holy water on homes from a distance. No one wants to live through that again. By evening, your sister's fever breaks slightly. Her skin is no longer burning, and her breathing slows. She sleeps more deeply, her brow smoothing for the first time all day. Your mother finally allows herself to sit down. She doesn't speak. She just stares into the fire, the lines around her mouth deeper than they were this morning. You lie awake for a long time that night, listening to the sound of her breathing. Each rise and fall of her chest is a blessing. You know that even if she recovers, others won't be so lucky. Someone else in the village will fall ill soon. That is the rhythm of life here. Health is borrowed, not owned. And when death comes, it doesn't always knock. In the age of the Crusades, death is not always noble. It doesn't come with banners or trumpets. It comes in the night, quietly, without warning. It comes from bad bread, from a rat bite, from a single cough across a crowded pew. It comes from water drawn from the wrong part of the stream, from fish caught on the wrong day, from hands not washed because soap is too rare. The healer returns 2 days later, not to your house, but to another nearby. Word spreads that a boy has collapsed near the fields. No one is surprised. No one asks why. They just bow their heads and murmur prayers. You begin to understand that survival here is not just about food and shelter. It's about timing, about luck, about forces beyond comprehension. You begin to carry small charms like your mother does, bits of bone, dried herbs tied with red thread. Not because you believe in magic, but because doing something, anything, feels better than nothing. At the week's end, your sister is sitting up. Pale and weak, but smiling. She doesn't remember much. You don't tell her how close she came. She doesn't need to know. You all pretend like she just had a passing fever. It's easier that way. Life moves on. The chores resume. The market beckons. The priest speaks of strength and faith. The blacksmith's hammer rings out again. But something in you has changed. Because now, you understand the truth. You wouldn't survive a day in the age of the Crusades, not because of war, or hunger, or even cruelty, but because you've never had to watch someone you love slip away while knowing there's nothing you can do but wait. Another day begins in the age of the Crusades, and this one brings no sense of occasion. The sun rises like it always does, pale and weak behind a thin curtain of clouds, casting gray light over the stone walls and straw roofs of your village. You stretch beneath your rough blanket, muscles sore, throat dry, and stomach hollow. Hunger has become so familiar it no longer alarms you. It simply sits there, like an uninvited guest that no one dares ask to leave. Breakfast, if it comes at all, is a humble affair. A bowl of gruel, mostly water with a few grains of barley swimming near the bottom, is passed around your family. There is no honey, no butter, not even salt. You sip it slowly, hoping to trick your stomach into thinking there is more than there is. It works for now. But you know the ache will return by midday. It always does. The harvest was poor last season. Too much rain, or not enough, no one can agree. But the result is the same: low stores, higher prices, and more mouths than meals. The Lord's men have already come through to collect their due, scraping up the last sacks of grain and driving away the fattest pigs. What remains must be rationed, measured out with care and desperation. There is no feast, no pantry, no second helping. Today you are sent to forage. You walk the perimeter of the village, staying near the edge of the woods where the brambles grow thick and wild herbs can sometimes be found. Your mother showed you how to tell the good ones from the poisonous: nettles that can be boiled into soup, roots that can be dried and ground into powder. You carry a sack, empty at first but slowly filling with leaves and stems. A rabbit darts across your path, and for a moment your heart races. But you have no trap, no bough. The meat runs free, and you are too slow to follow. Near a patch of overgrown brush, you find mushrooms. Some are harmless, some deadly. You hesitate. The difference is subtle, too subtle. You gather only the ones you're certain about. Last year, a neighbor made the wrong choice, and 3 members of her family never woke up. Hunger does not justify every risk. You also come across a patch of wild onions and dig a few from the soil. They're small and misshapen, but they'll flavor a pot of soup just enough to make it feel like food. When your sack is nearly full, you turn back. The clouds are thicker now, and the wind carries the scent of rain. On the way home, you pass another forager, a boy your age with dirt-smeared cheeks and twigs in his hair. He carries nothing. He asks if you've seen any berries, and you shake your head. He nods and walks on. You do not speak again. There is no sense in sharing what little you've found. In this world, charity is a luxury few can afford. Back home, your mother inspects the herbs and begins boiling a pot over the hearth. The water hisses, the herbs sizzle, and the house fills with a sharp, earthy scent. It is not appetizing, but it is warm. That, at least, is something. You eat in silence. Your sister, still recovering from her fever, picks at her portion with trembling fingers. Your father stares into the fire, eyes hollow. He has lost weight. His belt cinches tighter now. You pretend not to notice. After the meal, you return to your chores, but the weakness slows you. Carrying firewood feels like dragging stones. Mending a fishing net becomes a task that blurs your vision with fatigue. You sit down more often. Your hands shake. In the age of the Crusades, there is no margin for weakness. To fall behind is to be left behind. But hunger is not a choice. It is a creeping force that seeps into the bones, dulls the mind, and dims the light behind your eyes. You hear of a noble caravan passing through nearby. It's said they carry wagons of food, salted meats, cheeses, dried fruit, even honey cakes. You cannot imagine such bounty. Some in the village whisper of stealing from them, but most know better. The knights who guard those wagons do not forgive theft. They do not arrest. They do not question. They punish swiftly and without hesitation. A missing loaf might cost a hand, or worse. The church, of course, speaks of famine in spiritual terms. The priest says it is a trial of faith. That to endure hunger with humility is to be closer to God. He does not look hungry himself. He still wears gold thread on his robes. Still offers wine at Massachusetts. Still eats behind the heavy doors of the rectory. You begin to understand why some villagers turn away from the church, not openly, but quietly. Some speak of old gods, whispering in the dark. Some place offerings in the forest, coins or bread left beneath certain trees. Not because they believe, but because they need something, anything, that might listen. By evening, your body protests every movement. You fall into bed and stare at the ceiling, tracing the pattern of smoke stains on the stone. Your stomach growls, but there is no answer. You think of the feast days painted on the church walls, tables overflowing with bread and lamb, goblets of wine, laughter. It feels like a joke, a cruel fantasy. You dream of food that night. Not in the way someone might daydream of a delicious meal, but in the way someone drowns in a flood of longing. You smell roasting meat, hear the crunch of crusty bread, feel the weight of a full plate in your hands. And then you wake up with nothing but the bitter taste of your own tongue. The next morning, you will do it all again. You will forage, scrape, barter, and boil. You will count the bites on your plate before you eat. You will watch your family with the quiet fear that one of them might grow too thin, too tired, too silent. And you will endure. Because that is what people do in the age of the Crusades. They endure hunger, not as a temporary hardship, but as a permanent condition. And somehow, despite the gnawing emptiness that never fully leaves, they go on. In our modern world, the word travel evokes thoughts of exploration, adventure, or even leisure. But in the age of the Crusades, the word carries a weight far heavier than distance. Travel is not a choice, not a pleasure, and rarely a journey made without consequence. It is dangerous, punishing, and unpredictable, a path only taken when the risks of staying in place begin to outweigh the perils of the unknown. It begins with a reason, always a reason. For some, it's war, answering the call to crusade. For others, it's trade, the exchange of goods across borders and kingdoms. Sometimes it's necessity, escaping famine, fleeing from conflict, searching for work or lost family. But no one wakes up casually deciding to travel. The world outside your village is not just unfamiliar, it is hostile. You are sent out today, not to crusade or flee, but to deliver a message. Your village has no formal courier, no postal system. Messages are carried by foot or, for the wealthier, by horse. You are neither. You set out with a folded scrap of parchment tucked inside your tunic, sealed with wax and a pressed wooden mark. Your mother has entrusted it to you with clear instructions. Walk swiftly, avoid strangers, return before nightfall. It's only a few miles to the neighboring village, but every mile here feels like a battlefield waiting to happen. The road is more path than road, winding and narrow, bordered by hedges, fields, and clusters of leafless trees. Mud clings to your boots. Patches of standing water turn the ground to slick clay. The wind is sharp, and you pull your cloak tighter as you walk. The village disappears behind you quickly, swallowed by the rising fog. You are alone now. Travelers in this era do not travel alone by choice. They form caravans when they can, armed groups that ward off bandits and beasts. But you have no caravan. You are a child with a task, hoping your smallness and silence will keep you invisible. The road may look empty, but you are never truly alone. Bandits, deserters, even fellow villagers looking for an easy target, they all know this route. They know when the church bell rings and when the field's empty. They watch from the shadows. Every sound becomes a warning. A snap of a twig. A rustle in the underbrush. You walk faster, heart pounding, eyes scanning every shadow. You clutch the message to your chest, not for its content, which you don't know, but because it's the only reason you're out here. You pass a broken cart half sunk in the mud, its wheels shattered, its contents gone. Abandoned long ago. Perhaps its owner died nearby. You do not look for bones. You keep walking. Halfway through your journey, you cross a small stone bridge spanning a creek. It has no railing and is slick with moss. You tread carefully. The water below is shallow but icy and swift. Falling would mean more than a wet tunic, it could mean illness. And illness, as you know by now, is a threat not easily shaken. On the far side, you see another traveler. A man on foot, hunched and cloaked, walking with a stick. You step off the path, allowing space, eyes cast downward. He nods without speaking as he passes. You feel the tension in your shoulders long after he's gone. Every stranger is a coin flipped between threat and fellow sufferer. No one trusts. Everyone survives. When you finally reach the neighboring village, it is both familiar and foreign. The houses are the same, stone, straw, and smoke, but the faces are different. People glance at you with guarded expressions. You are an outsider here. You keep your hood up and find the home you were told to visit. A knock, a short exchange, and the message is gone. No questions asked? No hospitality offered. They close the door quickly behind you. You do not linger. The return journey feels longer. Your legs ache. Your stomach growls. The clouds have thickened, and rain begins to fall in a thin, cold sheet. You pull your cloak over your head and keep moving. The mud deepens. Your boots slip on wet leaves. Your fingers grow numb. You pass a cart traveling in the opposite direction, pulled by a horse with sad eyes and ribs showing. Its driver doesn't speak to you, just nods. In the cart are barrels and crates, covered with a tarp that shifts in the wind. You don't ask what's inside. You don't want to know. Travel is not just a test of endurance, it is a reminder of your place in the world. On the road, you are unprotected, unimportant. The laws of your village don't apply here. There is no guard to call, no neighbor to help, no priest to intervene. The road belongs to those who are strong, cunning, or armed. You return just before dark, soaked and shivering. Your mother pulls you inside without a word, checks your hands for cuts, your face for bruises. You sit by the fire, too tired to eat. The message is gone. Your task is done. But the fear, the cold, and the memory of every step remain. In the age of the Crusades, the road is a world unto itself, separate from the village, outside the church's reach, untouched by any promise of peace. It is a place where every traveler carries a story, and most of them are sad. For the pilgrims heading east, the road goes on for months, even years. Through hostile lands, foreign tongues, strange illnesses, and the constant threat of violence. Many never make it. Their bones lie in unmarked graves beside trails that twist through mountains, deserts, and coasts. But even here, in your small corner of the world, you have tasted that same risk. You have walked a mile, and it nearly unraveled you. Because in this time, every step taken away from home is a step closer to danger. And you now understand, in a way you never did before, why most people never leave. The sun doesn't wait for anyone in the age of the Crusades. It rises without fanfare, a pale disk behind veils of mist, shining down on a village already in motion. This morning is colder than the last, and the air carries a strange kind of tension. Not the ordinary kind that comes with hunger or hardship, but something sharper, something felt in the set of your father's jaw and the quick, nervous glances your mother casts toward the path leading out of town. It is tax day, again, and that means the arrival of the Lord's men. There is no warning for when they come. No posted schedule or list of expected contributions. They simply arrive when they please, and when they do, the village holds its breath. In this world, the law does not protect the people from their rulers. It exists to protect rulers from the people. The first sign comes when a rider is spotted near the tree line. The boy who sees him doesn't shout. He just turns and runs. That's the signal, the silent alarm. Women begin pulling children indoors, and men hurry to hide tools, coins, or anything that might be seized. Some families attempt to bury their stored grain beneath floorboards or behind the hearth. Others wrap up bits of dried meat or cheese and stuff them in haylofts, praying they won't be found. But hiding things is dangerous. If you're caught, the punishment is worse than the tax. It's called theft, stealing from the Lord who claims to own everything within his lands, including your crops, your tools, your livestock, and in some ways, your life. The riders come slowly at first, then all at once. 4 of them, dressed in the crest of the local baron, wearing leather jerkins and carrying short swords that look clean and well used. Their boots are caked with mud, their faces blank, and their eyes scanning every doorway, every cart, every villager who makes the mistake of holding eye contact too long. Behind them, a wagon rolls in, its bed empty for now but destined to be filled by the end of the day. One of the riders unfurls a scroll, though he doesn't read from it. He simply nods to the others, and they begin their rounds. The village, normally full of motion and murmuring, falls eerily quiet. The smithy goes cold. The baker closes his shutters. The church bells are silent. There is no protest. Everyone knows what comes next. The men move from house to house, stepping through thresholds as though they were doors to their own homes. There is no knocking, no asking. They point to sacks of grain, wheels of cheese, clay jugs filled with oil or wine. If the family hesitates, they are reminded, sometimes with words, sometimes with the back of a gloved hand, that refusal is not an option. If an item is deemed too small to be worth taking, they may still demand payment in coin, and if coin is unavailable, they may take a goat, a chicken, or even a pair of shoes. One family tries to explain that they have already paid this month. The rider does not respond. He simply kicks over their bucket of water and moves on. You and your family wait as long as you can, huddled inside the small stone house, listening to the sounds outside. Boots scraping against wood. Shouts. The clatter of a pot dropped in protest. A woman weeping. Then a knock on your door, sharp, heavy, unnecessary. Your father opens it, shoulders square, voice calm. The rider enters without a word, followed by another. Their eyes sweep the room, noting everything. The cooking pot in the corner. The half-empty sack of barley near the hearth. The small wooden chest where your mother keeps what little coin you've saved from market trades. The younger of the two riders points to the chest. Your mother hesitates. That moment of pause costs her. The older rider grabs your father's shoulder and pushes him back. Not hard enough to injure, but hard enough to humiliate. Your mother opens the chest, hands trembling. Inside are a few copper coins. The rider takes them all. Then they point to the goat. Your father protests quietly, but firmly. We need her for milk, he says. The rider shrugs. Then drink water, he replies. The goat is led outside. The door closes behind them. No receipt is given. No explanation offered. They leave, and you sit in silence. This is not robbery, at least not officially. This is tax collection. The Lord, who lives many miles away in a stone castle surrounded by men-at-arms and embroidered tapestries, claims the right to a share of everything his peasants produce. In theory, these taxes pay for protection, for guards who patrol the woods, for fortifications in times of war, for roads and bridges. But in practice, you see little return. The roads remain muddy. The bridges collapse in spring rains. The guards rarely appear unless someone is late with payment. And when they do arrive, they protect the rights of the noble, not the lives of the poor. There is no court where you can argue your case. No village council to petition. The church might offer sympathy, perhaps even a blessing, but it will not interfere with secular power. In fact, the church often benefits from the same system. Tithes are collected weekly. Offerings are encouraged, even demanded, in exchange for absolution. You are taxed by your Lord, and then taxed again by your God. Later that afternoon, the Lord's men stop at the village square. There, they gather what they've taken: sacks of flour, cured meat, chickens tied by their legs, bolts of homespun cloth. The wagon is half full now, and the men laugh quietly as they sip from a flask passed between them. One of them sharpens his blade on a whetstone, slowly, methodically. A child cries nearby, and his mother pulls him close, whispering something soft to calm him. You can't hear her words, but you know their rhythm. Hush, now. Don't look. Don't draw their eye. Before they leave, the leader of the group rides a slow circle through the center of the village, scanning faces as if memorizing them. It is not a threat spoken aloud, but it is clear nonetheless. They will return. They always return. The calendar is kept not by seasons, but by visits like this. The month when they took the goat. The week when they broke down the neighbor's door. The day when the baker was beaten for hiding flour beneath his bed. These events mark time as surely as the harvest or the frost. That night dinner is quieter than usual. The barley stew is thin. There is no milk. Your sister tries to ask where the goat has gone, but your mother hushes her gently. She's in a better place, she says. You know what that means. It means someone richer than you will be pouring your goat's milk into a silver cup by morning. You lie awake again, thinking about the men on horseback. Their confidence. Their smirks. The way they move through the village like they owned it, because, in truth, they do. Not personally, but symbolically. They represent a world where power flows upward and suffering trickles down. You remember the stories you've heard of peasants rising up, of rebellions and riots. But those are stories, not realities. Here, resistance is not noble, it is suicidal. And so, like everyone else, you wait for the next visit. You ration your grain more carefully. You hide a handful of eggs behind the woodpile. You tell yourself that maybe, just maybe, next month they'll take less. But deep down, you know better. Because in the age of the Crusades, you don't just work to survive. You work to be left alone. And even that is never guaranteed. Justice, as a concept, has always been shaped by the values of the society that defines it. In the age of the Crusades, however, justice was not a matter of fairness or truth but a tightly woven thread of fear, obedience, and social order. It was a world where the weight of a man's words was measured by the class he belonged to, where accusations could outlive the truth, and where the severity of a punishment had little to do with the crime and everything to do with who had power. On a morning that began like any other, the village stirred with a growing sense of unease. Word had spread that a thief had been caught, and although theft was not rare, the rumor that the Baron's men were returning to oversee the punishment themselves sent a chill through every household. You stepped outside with your father to gather firewood, and the air was heavy with expectation. There was no joy in the air, not even the morbid kind that comes when gossip turns into spectacle. It was a hushed sort of tension, like the forest waiting for a storm to break. Villagers spoke in low voices near the well, their words barely rising above whispers. The thief, it was said, had been caught near the granary 2 nights prior, trying to make off with a small sack of wheat. No one claimed to know who it was, but everyone had their theories. Some thought it was the widow's son, always seen lurking around the baker's hut with hungry eyes. Others said it was a traveler who had slipped into the village at dusk, unnoticed until it was too late. Regardless of who it was, the outcome would be the same. The punishment was not about rehabilitation or forgiveness. It was about control. By midday, the square had filled. Men stood shoulder to shoulder in silence. Women huddled with their children at the edge of the crowd. The priest stood near the church steps, hands folded and eyes distant, unwilling to interfere but determined to be seen. When the Baron's men arrived, it was not with fanfare or ceremony but with the dull sound of hooves against dry earth. 3 riders, armored in chain mail and dark surcoats bearing the sigil of the Lord, rode at a measured pace through the crowd. Behind them came a cart, not for the prisoner, but for the display of authority they intended to leave behind. On it stood a small wooden platform and a post embedded with iron rings. The sight of it made your stomach turn. They pulled a boy from behind the cart, barely more than your age. His tunic was torn at the collar, one eye swollen shut, a smear of dried blood on his cheek. He did not cry. He looked straight ahead, jaw clenched, face empty. It was not the widow's son. It was someone you didn't know. A stranger. That made it worse somehow. Because it meant the punishment would be absolute. No mercy, no leniency, no negotiations whispered through back doors or church pews. The crowd watched as the boy was dragged forward and tied to the post. His hands were bound with rough rope, his shoulders exposed where his tunic had been ripped. One of the guards stepped forward with a short whip. The Baron's steward, a man with narrow eyes and a voice like gravel, announced that the boy had confessed to stealing from the granary. There was no mention of why. No discussion of hunger, of need, of desperation. Only the crime, the confession, and the punishment. The whip cracked through the air once, then again. Each strike drew a reaction not just from the boy, whose body jerked involuntarily with each lash, but from the crowd. No one shouted. No one intervened. But people flinched, looked away, or closed their eyes. You wanted to turn, but your father's hand rested on your shoulder, firm and still. You had to watch. Everyone did. That was the point. The punishment was not only for the thief. It was for you, for your neighbors, for every soul who might one day feel hunger clawing at their ribs and wonder if taking a loaf of bread might be worth the risk. By the 10th strike, the boy's knees gave out, but he was held upright by the ropes. His face was pale, his lips bloodied. When the whipping stopped, he was cut free and dropped to the ground. He did not move. The guards gave no orders to help him. He was left lying there, curled in on himself, as the riders turned their horses and departed without another word. The cart and the post remained in the square, a deliberate monument to the reach of power. Slowly, The villagers began to disperse. A few brave souls approached the boy. Someone covered him with a cloak. Someone else brought water. But the message had been delivered. The laws of this time were not built on balance or mediation. They were built on spectacle, deterrence, and hierarchy. You learned that day how justice worked in the age of the Crusades. It was swift, brutal, and public. There were no juries, no defense, no second chances. A man could lose his hand for theft, his tongue for blasphemy, or his life for an insult if directed at the wrong person. The severity of the punishment had less to do with the crime and more to do with the social position of the one offended. Nobles rarely faced consequences. Priests were shielded by divine authority. But peasants, those who labored and begged and endured, had no such protection. Justice was also inconsistent. One week, a thief might be whipped. The next, hanged. Another might be branded or thrown into a pit outside the village and left to die. It depended on who was present, who had power, and what mood they were in. Appeals were rare and rarely heard. Even the church, which sometimes offered sanctuary, could not always be trusted. Priests might shelter a fugitive in the chapel, but only if they thought it served God's glory or their own interests. There were rumors of vigilante justice, villagers taking matters into their own hands in the dead of night. A stolen chicken answered with a broken door. A missing coin repaid with a punch in the jaw. These actions were whispered about, never openly admitted. Because when formal justice failed or became too dangerous, people found their own ways of protecting themselves. That, too, was dangerous. Retribution could start feuds that lasted generations. Families remembered insults long after the actual cause was forgotten. A spilled drink at the market might become a knife in the ribs a year later, all because one man believed another had not been properly punished by the Lord's court. The landscape of justice in the age of the Crusades was also deeply influenced by superstition. Illnesses, accidents, or even poor harvests were often blamed on witches, demons, or heretics. Trials by ordeal were still practiced in some regions. A man accused of lying might be forced to plunge his hand into boiling water. If his wounds healed cleanly, he was deemed innocent. If they festered, he was guilty. Women accused of sorcery might be tied and thrown into a river. If they floated, it meant the devil kept them buoyant. If they drowned, they were considered innocent, though dead all the same. In such a system, there was no true path to justice, only survival. Your village was not immune to this kind of thinking. When the weather turned foul for 3 weeks straight, someone suggested that the old healer who lived on the outskirts had angered the heavens. A group of men went to her hut, demanding answers. She stood firm, muttering prayers in Latin and refusing to explain herself. That act alone was enough. She was dragged before the priest and made to confess sins she had never committed. The villagers who once relied on her remedies now watched in silence as her hut was burned and she was cast out. You never saw her again. Justice, you came to realize, was not something you could rely on. It was not a constant force like the rising of the sun or the turning of the seasons. It was a shapeshifter, a tool in the hands of those who already had control. For the peasants, for your family, it was something to fear, to avoid, to endure. As you lay in bed that night, your thoughts turned again to the boy who had been whipped in the square. You wondered where he was now, whether he had survived, whether anyone had taken him in. You thought of the blood that had stained the earth beneath him, how it had mixed with the dust to form something permanent. That image would stay with you, like a lesson carved into your bones. In this world, innocence was irrelevant. Mercy was optional. And justice was not blind, it stared you down with clear, calculating eyes. You whispered a prayer, not for justice, but for safety. Because you understood now that the only real justice in the age of the Crusades was the kind that never found you. The days in the age of the Crusades passed like smoke, shifting and fading with little warning, and by the time your village began to speak in anxious murmurs of war again, the air had already changed. It wasn't just the wind that blew colder or the clouds that hung heavier over the trees. It was the way people moved, hurried, distracted, cautious. The men of the village began rising earlier and working longer hours, not because the fields had become more demanding, but because their thoughts were elsewhere. War, the kind that most villagers only heard about in sermons or rumors, was beginning to feel uncomfortably close, as if the world beyond the forests and hills was now pressing inward, tightening its grip. You first sensed it in the absence of those who once lingered in familiar places. The village blacksmith, who usually struck up idle conversation while hammering iron, now spent his days in silence, fashioning blades instead of plows. The traveling peddler, once a monthly visitor who traded beads and bolts of faded cloth, hadn't been seen in weeks. Even the priest, who regularly offered sermons on eternal salvation, had shifted his focus to more earthly concerns. He spoke now of sacrifice and battle, of righteous conquest, and the promise of eternal life for those who died under the cross. These weren't just idle words. They were preparations, and the village was listening. The Crusades were not new. Everyone in the village knew the stories. They had heard about the Holy Land, about Jerusalem, about the armies of Christendom marching across deserts and mountains to reclaim sacred soil. But those were stories from far-off places, involving men with names you would never pronounce and battles fought in lands you would never see. The idea that war could reach you, touch your home, your family, your village, had always seemed distant. Now, for the first time, that illusion had cracked. It began when the Baron's steward returned with a new order. Unlike the tax collections, which came with sneers and threats, this visit came with parchment, seals, and a carefully chosen smile. He gathered the men in the center of the village and read aloud the proclamation. Pope Urban had renewed the call for crusade. Every able-bodied man within the Baron's domain was expected to prepare. It was not yet a draft, but the message was clear. Those who volunteered would be blessed, protected, and remembered. Those who did not might still be called. The promise of divine reward was tempting to many. Forgiveness of sins, freedom from debts, and the chance to claim land or spoils in distant lands were powerful incentives. But for most of the villagers, the call to crusade was not about glory. It was about pressure, about not wanting to be labeled a coward, a heretic, or a traitor to the church. Men who hesitated too long found their neighbors watching them with suspicion. Whispers started. Judgments were made in silence. Your father, too old to be summoned, said little. He sharpened his sickle more often than before and spent long hours tending to the walls of the house, reinforcing the beams as if expecting a storm. You noticed how your mother began stockpiling dried food, barley, lentils, and what little meat could be smoked. She offered no explanation, but her nervous hands and tired eyes said everything. Your older cousin, who once joked about the foolishness of crusading nobles, now practiced with a wooden sword behind his hut. He didn't laugh anymore. The village itself began to change in small, strange ways. Symbols of faith appeared more often, crosses carved into doors, small crucifixes tied to fence posts, rosaries hanging from window latches. People prayed more openly and often. The priest led processions through the streets, blessing homes and fields, asking for protection. When a child fell ill, it was seen as a sign. When a fox was found dead near the stream, the villagers buried it with prayers instead of curses. Everything felt like an omen. Then the soldiers came. Not many, just 6, but they brought with them the weight of the world beyond the village. Clad in chainmail and cloaks marked with the cross, they were not the disorderly tax collectors the village had come to fear, but trained men, disciplined and direct. They spoke to the steward, to the priest, and then to the villagers. They offered no threats, only certainty. War was coming. More troops would pass through soon. The roads would become dangerous. The forests might be filled with deserters or raiders. Any man who could fight would be expected to do so. The soldiers spoke of Saracens, of infidels who defiled the Holy Land, who mocked God and desecrated churches. They described atrocities in distant cities, fire and sword, and rivers that ran red. Whether their stories were true didn't matter. What mattered was the fear they left behind. The soldiers remained for 3 nights, setting up camp outside the village, where they cooked simple meals and repaired their gear. Children crept to the edge of their tents, wide-eyed and silent, watching the warriors polish blades and whisper prayers. One night you heard singing, low, mournful hymns rising through the mist. It sounded like sorrow, not triumph. On their final morning, they left behind a single blade and a rolled scroll for the steward, then vanished into the fog, leaving the village once again to itself. But it was not the same village. That night, the conversations around the hearth grew darker. Your father warned you never to leave the village road alone again. Your mother sewed protective charms into your cloak. People began asking questions that had once been unthinkable. What would you do if the army came to take your brother? What if the Lord demanded your home to quarter soldiers? What if raiders came through the woods? What if the priests sided with them? There were no answers, only silence. The Crusades had always seemed like a distant fire. Now, the smoke was on the wind. Within a week, the first volunteer from your village departed. A quiet man, unmarried, who had once been a shepherd. He left with only a cloak, a staff, and a small wooden cross carved by his sister. The priest blessed him in front of the chapel. The villagers stood watching as he walked away, some in awe, some in fear. 2 others followed soon after. Then another. The village shrank a little more each time, not just in numbers but in spirit. One night your cousin asked your father what he would have done if he were younger. Your father didn't answer immediately. He stared into the fire for a long time before saying, "I would have run. Not out of fear, but because I knew what war really meant." No one asked him to explain. His silence said more than words could. As the days passed, the sense of waiting grew unbearable. Every knock on the door sounded like a summons. Every distant hoofbeat made your heart race. Your mother began teaching your sister how to boil herbs for wounds, even though she had never done so before. Your father sharpened every blade in the house, from kitchen knives to scythes. Not because he planned to fight, but because dull tools are dangerous when there's no one left to make more. One evening, as you gathered water from the well, you looked across the field and saw a line of riders moving along the distant ridge. Their banners were unfamiliar, their armor glinting faintly in the fading light. You ran home as fast as your legs would carry you, breathless and pale. By the time your father reached the spot, the riders were gone. Whether they had seen the village or passed it by, no one knew. That night, no one slept. In the age of the Crusades, war didn't need to arrive with trumpet blasts or burning torches. It arrived quietly, in footsteps you couldn't trace and fears you couldn't name. It settled into your bones, reshaped your days, and rewrote your future without ever asking your permission. It taught you that peace was not the absence of conflict, but the brief pause between one kind of suffering and another. The age of the Crusades was not only defined by sword and fire, nor solely by the clang of steel or the roar of angry prayers echoing through the stone halls of cathedrals. Just as central to this time, just as real and deeply embedded in the lives of every man, woman, and child, was the persistent, inescapable shadow of grief. It wasn't the kind of grief that arrived with ceremony, with funerals dressed in black or eulogies filled with polished words. It was the quieter kind, the kind that slipped into everyday life, settled beside you at the hearth, and watched you stir the soup while your hands moved without feeling. In your village, loss was not an exception but a rhythm, and one you began to understand not through stories or superstition, but through your own aching silence. It began with a cough, soft at first, barely noticed. A woman from the far end of the village, strong and wide-shouldered, with a laugh that used to carry down the lane like music, had fallen ill. She had helped your family once during a rough harvest, lending tools without being asked, asking for nothing in return. You remembered how she had stood with her sleeves rolled up, arms thick with the strength of someone used to work, and had scolded your father gently for trying to dig a stubborn root from dry ground. Now she lay inside her home, her husband at her side, and the sound that came from her chest was not the sound of strength but of something breaking down, slowly and without grace. The healer visited, then the priest, then the silence. The next morning, the shutters of their home were closed, and stayed that way. No one spoke openly, but everyone knew. The village changed with the knowledge. People walked more quietly, kept their eyes lowered, and chose their words with care. The children were told not to ask questions. The well was cleaned twice. Salt was sprinkled at the thresholds of homes. For days, the air itself felt heavier, as though the breath of the village had slowed to match the pace of mourning. There was no formal burial. There rarely was. Graves were dug by hand at the edge of the forest, marked with simple stones or wooden crosses that leaned with the weight of time. No headstones, no carved names, only the knowledge passed from one mouth to another. That is where she lies. Her family gathered in private. There was no feast, no procession. The church permitted a few words, spoken in Latin, before the priest moved on to the next task. Grief did not stop the harvest, nor delay the tax, nor shield the grieving from hunger. The fields still needed tending. The cows still needed milking. And so, while the world paused to remember, it also continued, indifferent and unrelenting. What surprised you most was not the sadness, but the quiet. It wasn't a silence of peace, but of restraint. In this world, there were no therapists, no journals, no time to weep in privacy. There was only work, and the occasional murmur of sympathy in passing. She was strong, someone would say. God must have needed her, another might offer. These were not comforts so much as ritual, words passed down like family recipes, meant to fill the silence, not solve it. You began to see grief everywhere. In the eyes of the man who no longer whistled on his walk to the fields. In the way the baker stared too long at the fire. In the empty seat beside the smith, where his son once sat mending broken nails. Loss was not something that struck a village, it lived in it, quietly, like smoke in the rafters, like dust in the corners of every room. One afternoon, while gathering firewood near the edge of the forest, you came upon a small bundle of cloth tied around a tree. Inside were wilted herbs, a carved wooden token, and a scrap of wool. It was a makeshift memorial, not placed with permission, but with love. Someone had lost something, and had marked it the only way they knew how. You didn't touch it. You only stood nearby for a moment, head bowed, unsure why tears had crept to the edge of your vision. The healer told your mother that loss was not a wound, but a season. It visits like winter, she said, and stays as long as it wishes. Your mother nodded, as if those words confirmed something she had always known but never dared say aloud. At night you began to listen differently. The creak of the beams above you, the wind between the stones, the soft weeping from across the room. These were not sounds to fear. They were the sounds of people holding themselves together when the world gave them no tools to do so. Over time, the village learned to fold grief into daily life. The woman who had died was not forgotten, but her memory became part of the fabric of the village itself, referenced in stories, missed during festivals, honored in the careful way her husband now braided the rope at the well, as she used to do. No one said her name often, but her absence was felt in every detail. You began to understand that remembrance in this world was not carved in marble but carried in motion, in tasks performed with reverence, in meals prepared using her old recipes, in the way her house was kept even after her family moved away. The Crusades had taught the world how to glorify death, how to dress it in banners and hymns and the promise of eternal reward. But in the village, where the fighting rarely reached, death arrived in its truest form, quiet, slow, cruel in its simplicity. There were no songs for the dead here. Only footsteps, moving forward because they had to. Only hands that kept working. Only hearts that kept breaking without sound. One evening you sat by the fire, staring at the embers. Your father spoke of a man he once knew who had gone to the Holy Land and never returned. He said he wanted to see Jerusalem, your father said, voice low. But he didn't make it past the sea. You asked if he had been brave. Your father didn't answer right away. He only said, he was tired. It was the first time you realized that courage and weariness could live in the same body. That grief could be the reason someone left, and also the reason someone stayed. You carried that understanding with you for days, then weeks. You began noticing the way others held on to memories, not through monuments or songs, but through ordinary acts. A mother teaching her daughter to sew the same pattern into a tunic. A father teaching his son how to bind a wound just so. A neighbor planting herbs in the same corner of the garden each year, not because it was fertile, but because it was his late wife's favorite spot. These were the memorials of your world, quiet and invisible to anyone who wasn't looking. As time moved on, the woman who had died became one of many. Her story was folded into the greater narrative of the village. Her name was added to the list of those remembered in whispered prayers before meals. Her memory lived in the way people treated each other more gently for a few weeks, as if reminded that life was more fragile than it seemed. And so, you learn that grief in the age of the Crusades did not disappear. It did not resolve. It did not fade completely. It lingered, it molded, and it returned in moments when you least expected it. It became part of who you were, like calluses on your hands or the rhythm of your footsteps. It was not spoken, but it was understood. In a world that glorified sacrifice on distant battlefields, the greatest acts of love were found in remembering those who had simply lived, and lost, in silence. In the world of the Crusades, belief and fear were often inseparable. Every flicker of candlelight in a dark corner, every strange dream, every poor harvest or unexpected death could be seen as a sign, a message from forces beyond understanding. People didn't just believe in God. They believed in curses, in charms, in omens, and in spirits that lingered in the trees or crept across rooftops at night. Faith wasn't confined to churches and sermons. It was woven into every step you took, every meal you ate, every illness you survived. To live in this age wasn't only to live under the eye of the church, it was to walk through a world where the unseen was just as real, just as present, and sometimes even more powerful than the people beside you. Your first brush with this invisible world came not through priests or scriptures, but through your grandmother. Long before she passed, she would sit by the fire on long, cold nights, weaving tales of creatures that lurked at the edge of the village, of woods that should not be entered at dusk, of whispers heard by those who refused to cover their mirrors after sunset. She wasn't afraid when she told these stories. She didn't shake or whisper. She told them with the same calm certainty that she used when explaining how to make onion broth or mend a tunic. To her, the spirits and signs of the world weren't things to fear. They were simply things to respect. You remembered one night in particular, when the wind howled louder than usual, and your mother had tossed a handful of salt into the hearth before going to bed. No one explained why. No one needed to. It was just something that was done, like crossing yourself before a journey or spitting over your shoulder after seeing a black crow. These weren't rituals of the church. They were rituals of the people, passed down in whispers, in gestures, in the silence between words. The healer, too, was deeply steeped in these practices. Though she worked with herbs and salves and poultices, she also muttered prayers in languages no one else understood. She hung bones from the rafters of her hut and tied strings around her wrists and ankles. When a child was born, she would place a clove of garlic beneath the cradle to ward off evil. When someone died, she would throw salt over the threshold and mark the door with ash to confuse wandering spirits. You once saw her bury a bundle of feathers tied with red twine beneath a tree, muttering all the while. No one questioned her. No one dared. She might have been feared, but she was also trusted. In a world without doctors or scientific explanations, her ways were better than nothing, and sometimes they worked. The church officially condemned many of these beliefs. Priests warned that such practices bordered on heresy, that charms and superstitions were the tools of the devil. But even the priests could not completely deny the pull of the old ways. You once saw your village priest murmur a Latin blessing while rubbing his fingers over a smooth stone, hidden in the sleeve of his robe. You heard him warn against witches, though no one ever called anyone a witch aloud. That word was too dangerous, too final. Still, it lingered in people's minds, like a wolf pacing just out of sight. In the fields, your father would sometimes refuse to start planting on certain days of the moon. He would watch the clouds and sniff the wind, not just for weather, but for signs. A bird landing on the roof at the wrong hour, a dog howling in the middle of the day. These were not coincidences. They were warnings. People didn't wait for confirmation. They acted. They changed plans, stayed indoors, lit candles, or recited prayers. Not because they were sure, but because they couldn't afford to be wrong. Superstition filled the gaps left by uncertainty. When someone fell ill, It wasn't always blamed on cold air or spoiled food. Sometimes it was the result of a curse, a jealous glance, or a forgotten ritual. You remembered when a neighbor's cow died suddenly. The villagers gathered to inspect the animal, then whispered that its owner had once spoken ill of the healer. The very next day, the man placed a small offering of bread and herbs on the edge of the healer's fence. She didn't speak to him. She didn't need to. By the end of the week, he had buried the cow and never said another unkind word again. Children were raised with a strange blend of religion and folklore. You were taught to pray to the saints but also told never to whistle after dark. You were encouraged to attend Mass, but warned not to speak the names of the dead too loudly. Everyone believed in miracles, but they also believed in shadows that moved too quickly, in footsteps heard on the roof when no one was there. Every creak in the wood, every strange light in the sky, every sickness without explanation could become a story, a lesson, a warning. You found yourself adopting these habits, even without realizing it. You tapped the doorframe twice before entering certain homes. You avoided certain crossroads after dusk. You whispered a prayer when passing the well. Not out of fear exactly, but out of caution, because everyone knew someone who had ignored the signs, and their stories never ended well. One year, when the harvest failed and rain flooded the fields, people began to look for someone to blame. At first, it was quiet. A few sideways glances, a few muttered complaints. Then someone remembered an old woman who lived alone near the river, who never attended church and spoke to herself in the garden. She had never caused trouble before, but in hard times, that didn't matter. She was different. That was enough. You watched from a distance as the men confronted her. She didn't resist. She only stood there, silent, eyes sharp as the wind. They accused her of cursing the fields, of poisoning the well, of bringing death to the livestock. She said nothing. The priest didn't speak up. Neither did the healer. By the end of the day, her hut was burned. She was gone. No one said where. No one asked. Afterward, the rain stopped. The sun returned. The harvest recovered. People said nothing, but their silence was not forgetfulness, it was fear. The event became a lesson, a cautionary tale passed in lowered voices. No one mentioned her by name again. You came to understand that in this world, belief was not a matter of choice. It was survival. If the world was filled with unseen dangers, then you needed unseen protections. If misfortune could come from anywhere, then you needed rituals, charms, and blessings to keep it at bay. The church offered salvation after death, but the old ways offered protection while you were still breathing, and for many, that mattered more. In the age of the Crusades, superstition was not ignorance. It was adaptation. It was a language spoken in gestures, a form of wisdom passed down in the space between breaths. It was the reason your mother tied a red ribbon to the door, why your father threw a pinch of flour into the fire, why you found yourself turning your shoes a certain way before sleep without knowing why. And when the wind howled through the trees at night, or when the fire cracked too loudly in the hearth, or when the shadows flickered just a little too long against the wall, you didn't question the fear that rose in your chest. You simply whispered a name, crossed your arms, and waited for morning. Because in this world, the unknown was not an idea. It was a neighbor. And you had learned how to live beside it. Childhood in the age of the Crusades was not defined by games, learning, or discovery, but by preparation for a life that would likely be short, painful, and ruled by obligation. There were no schools in your village. There were no tutors, no reading lessons, no chalkboards or scrolls of knowledge carefully unrolled on sunny mornings. The only education that mattered was survival. Children were raised not to explore who they were, but to become who they were expected to be. From the moment you could stand, you were part of the laboring world, trained by the hands of your parents, shaped by the expectations of the village, and watched carefully by the eyes of the church. There was no softness in this upbringing, only a kind of hard-edged love, a desperate hope that the more you learned early, the less you would suffer later. Boys were trained beside their fathers, expected to lift tools too heavy for their arms and follow instructions that allowed no argument. You learned to carry wood before you could speak in full sentences. You knew how to pluck feathers from a dead chicken before you could count beyond 10. You were taught to dig, to plant, to sow, and to bind wounds long before anyone explained why the world was broken or why you must work even when your fingers bled. Girls, meanwhile, were taken under the care of their mothers or older sisters, taught to knead dough, mend torn clothing, feed animals, and care for the sick. They were told not to cry when their knuckles cracked from scrubbing floors or when their faces stung from sudden slaps meant to correct mistakes. Every lesson was steeped in necessity, not nurture. Play was not forbidden, but it was fleeting and often hidden. Sometimes, when no one was watching, children would gather near the edge of the woods to build makeshift castles from sticks or stage pretend battles with broken tools. They would chase chickens for sport or roll rocks down hills, laughing until someone shouted their name in anger and reminded them of their chores. Toys were rare and always handmade. A carved wooden figure, a doll stuffed with straw, a hoop fashioned from bent iron wire, these were treasures. There was no such thing as boredom, only work interrupted by exhaustion. If you ever said aloud that you were bored, your father would hand you a shovel or your mother would assign you twice the weaving. Still, there were moments when innocence flickered. A child's laugh over a shared crust of bread. A wide-eyed story whispered under the stars about dragons or saints or distant cities made of gold. These stories were always borrowed, passed down like secret heirlooms, their details shifting with every retelling. Children believed in magic because they had to, because the world they lived in offered so little wonder that imagination was their only rebellion. You grew up listening to tales of crusading knights and miracles, but even as a child, you understood that these stories belonged to someone else, to the nobles, to the clergy, to those who would never dig in the same dirt you did. Illness was an ever-present danger, and children were particularly vulnerable. Every winter claimed one or two. A cough could turn deadly overnight. A scrape might fester into a fever. When a child disappeared from the village square or a cradle was left empty, people grieved quietly, then returned to work. Mourning was a luxury few could afford. Parents did not speak often of lost children, but their absence lingered in the way their siblings were treated more harshly, in the sudden hush that fell over conversations at the mention of a name. Sometimes a child would be buried with a small token, a piece of string, a carved cross, a favorite wooden button, but never with fanfare. The ground was hard, the shovels dull, and the grief buried deeper than the grave. The church spoke of children as innocent, pure, and closest to God, yet did little to protect them. Priests baptized newborns quickly, sometimes within hours of birth, fearful that the child might die before being welcomed into the faith. If a baby died unbaptized, it was whispered that their soul would wander, never reaching heaven. This fear led to desperate midnight ceremonies, infants dunked into cold water by candlelight, prayers mumbled through tears and panic. You remembered your younger brother's baptism vividly, not because of the ritual, but because your mother nearly fainted from exhaustion after giving birth only a few hours earlier. Still, she clutched him to her chest and insisted on walking to the chapel barefoot in the cold. As you grew older, your responsibilities expanded. Boys began training with wooden swords, preparing not only for the defense of the village, but for the possibility of crusade. The idea that you might one day be called to leave everything behind and march east was presented not as a dream, but as an inevitability. The priest would visit the boys and describe the Holy Land in glowing terms, speaking of sand that shimmered like gold and cities built by angels. He said that dying in service to the cross would guarantee eternal life, but he never said what would happen if you chose not to go. You practiced thrusting and parrying with dull sticks while wondering whether the sand in those faraway places burned hotter than the sun on your neck. Girls were prepared for marriage almost as soon as they could walk steadily and carry water without spilling. Their value was tied to their ability to keep a home, raise children, and serve without complaint. Love was never part of the conversation. Marriages were arranged by fathers, sealed with livestock, and announced like market trades. Your cousin, barely 13, was promised to a man twice her age because he owned 3 goats and had a sturdy roof. She didn't cry at the news. She only stared at her hands. and you wondered if she was thinking about the dolls she had buried in the yard 2 summers earlier when her mother said it was time she learned how to spin flax. Discipline for children was swift and unforgiving. A broken bowl might earn a beating. A whispered complaint could lead to hours of kneeling on stone floors. Defiance was met with force, not because parents lacked love, but because they feared what would happen if their children grew up soft. Every adult you knew bore scars from their childhood, faded bruises, stiff fingers, crooked backs, and they carried these as badges, proof that they had survived. You understood early that to be a child was not to be protected, but to be molded, prepared, and tested. The world was not waiting for you with open arms. It was waiting with claws. Despite this, there was a fierce kind of loyalty between children. You shared food, secrets, and hiding spots. You whispered prayers for each other when someone fell ill. When your friend's brother was taken by the fever, you stood outside his house every day until he came back out. You didn't speak of it. You just handed him a small rock you had found near the stream, smooth and round. He kept it in his pocket for years, even after it cracked in half. These small acts, silent, wordless, were how children in your world learned to love. As war crept closer and more men left the village, children were expected to take on their work. 10-year-olds tended to livestock. 12-year-olds patrolled the edge of the fields with sticks and slings, watching for raiders. You heard that in some villages, children had been taken to fill the ranks of armies, used not as warriors, but as workers, carriers, even bait. You didn't know if those stories were true. You didn't want to find out. But each time a horse passed through the village, your mother held your shoulder a little tighter. The world you knew did not give you time to become who you were meant to be. It told you who you had to become and demanded you get there quickly. The church offered the promise of salvation. The Lord demanded loyalty. Your family expected labor. And the world, with all its harsh winds and uncertain paths, expected you to endure without complaint. But within the cracks of that hard life, there was still something tender, something quietly human. It lived in the way your sister shared her bread when she thought you were hungrier. It whispered through the songs you hummed while hauling water. It flickered in the warmth of a hand held too long on a cold night. In the age of the Crusades, childhood was not a time of becoming. It was a time of enduring. And yet, somehow, in the midst of labor and loss, fire and frost, there remained a piece of you that could dream. As the sun slipped behind the trees and cast its final amber light across the fields, the village quieted in a way that was not quite peace, but something close to it. The work of the day, whatever it had demanded, was over. The animals had been fed, the fires lit, the bread laid out to cool. No carts moved along the roads. No bells rang. No sermons echoed across the hills. Just the soft rhythm of wooden shutters closing, of children being called inside, of spoons scraping the bottom of bowls. The age of the Crusades was not a time known for comfort, yet there was a certain familiarity in these evenings, a repetition that made the world feel stable even when it was not. The last light of day bathed everything in a soft glow, catching the curves of the church bell and the cracks in the stone cottages. Smoke rose from the chimneys, curling skyward in threads that caught the dying light like silver wire. You stood outside the house for a moment longer than usual, your hands cold, your breath visible, watching the sky shift from gold to gray. The clouds had parted just enough to reveal the first star, and though you didn't know its name, you whispered a short prayer toward it out of habit. You weren't sure whether it was for protection, or luck, or simply to give shape to the silence. Inside, your family had gathered. Your mother stirred the last of the evening stew, thin and watery but warm, and your father sat by the fire, sharpening a blade that was used more for cutting rope than anything else. Your younger sister sat with her head resting on her knees, eyes half closed, humming a tune you remembered from years ago. There was no conversation, only the occasional glance, the small gestures of a family who had shared so many seasons that words were no longer required. Everyone had a role, a rhythm, a place. And in the dim light of the hearth, the world seemed to shrink to the walls of your home. The stew was passed around in silence, each person taking only what they needed. You ate slowly, not because you were full, but because you wanted the warmth to last as long as possible. The taste was familiar: onion, bitter greens, barley, flavors that had defined your entire life. There was no luxury in it, but there was comfort in its consistency. It reminded you that, despite everything the world demanded, some things remained the same. After dinner, the fire was stoked one final time, and the room filled with the soft crackle of flames. Shadows danced across the stone walls, flickering like old memories. Your father leaned back against the wall, eyes closed, not quite asleep. Your mother gathered bits of cloth to mend, her fingers moving slowly in the fading light. You sat cross-legged near the hearth, watching the flame but thinking of other things. You thought about the men who had left for the crusade and never returned. You thought about the healer who had vanished into the woods, the children who had stopped playing in the village square, the woman whose laughter no longer echoed in the mornings. Loss, like the fire, never burned all at once. It smoldered slowly, leaving behind the scent of what had once been whole. You thought, too, of the road beyond the village, the one that curved through the trees and disappeared into the unknown. You had walked it once, long ago, carrying a message in your tunic and fear in your chest. You remembered how your heart had pounded at every rustling branch, how the wind had whispered secrets you didn't understand. That road still existed, still led somewhere, but you no longer looked at it with curiosity. Now, it was a warning, a boundary between the suffering you knew and the suffering you couldn't imagine. The church had told you that this life was only the beginning, that pain was a test and poverty a path to grace. But as the fire dimmed and your sister curled into your side for warmth, you couldn't help but wonder if the promise of paradise was simply another way to keep people quiet. Not because you lacked faith, but because faith did not fill empty bellies or mend broken roofs. It did not stop men from dying in wars they didn't start, or women from being forgotten in their grief, or children from being sold into futures they didn't choose. Still, even in doubt, there was devotion. Every evening ended the same way. Your father would whisper a prayer before sleep, short and steady. Your mother would kiss her thumb and press it to the doorframe. Your sister would murmur something half-dreamt as she dozed off. You would lie beneath your coarse blanket, staring at the beams above, listening to the wind creep through the cracks in the wall. You would think about everything you had seen that day, about the man who had collapsed in the field from exhaustion, the woman who had sold her last hen at market, the child who had cried silently when her doll's head snapped off, and you would carry those moments with you into sleep. Because that was what the end of each day required. To gather all the little fragments of sorrow, of effort, of resilience, and tuck them away like embers in your chest. You could not set them aside. They were part of you now. Just as the smoke was part of the stone, the salt part of the bread, the ache part of the body. Outside, the village fell into deeper stillness. The animals had quieted. The stars now dotted the sky in full. Somewhere, a dog barked once, then went silent. Somewhere else, a shutter creaked in the wind. But inside your home, the world held its breath. There were no more words to be said, no more work to be done. Just the warmth of the fire fading slowly into darkness, and the knowledge that, with any luck, tomorrow would begin again. In the age of the Crusades, nothing was guaranteed. Not life. Not peace. Not justice. But each evening, for those who survived the day, there was this: a moment to breathe, to sit in the stillness, to hold your family close, and to remember that even in a world built on hardship, there was still something left to hold on to. Because while the world burned beyond the hills and thundered with the sound of distant war, here, in this quiet place, something softer remained, not joy, perhaps, but endurance. And in the age of the Crusades, that was enough. Thank you for spending time in this quiet corner of the past. The age of the Crusades was filled with hardship, with long days and longer nights, but in the quiet between battles and burdens, people still found ways to carry on, through small routines, shared meals, whispered prayers, and moments of stillness by the fire. Life was never easy, yet somehow, it continued. The same way it always has. As you drift off to sleep, imagine the soft glow of a candle flickering in a stone cottage, the gentle hush of winds slipping through the trees, and the steady rhythm of footsteps on packed earth. These sounds, once real, now echo gently in memory, reminding us that even the hardest times held moments of calm. Let those quiet echoes carry you now into rest. Sleep well, and until next time, may peace wrap around you like a woolen blanket in the dark.